The sound of burning temples echoes across the citadel of Ai. It is the autumn of 1407, and Lady Linh stands in the courtyard of her family's residence, watching the trans soldiers set fire to the royal archives. She is 17 years old. Her name, once a mark of nobility in this kingdom that her family has served for 3 generations, now means nothing. The commander's soldiers move through the corridors like hunters through tall grass, and she understands with cold certainty that this is the moment everything changes. Around her, other women from the defeated court stand in silent rows: musicians, dancers, concubines, wives, attendants. Some are older, some younger. All are about to become property. Lin's father was a general. Her mother came from a merchant family aligned with the kingdom of Champa. Such connections mean death or enslavement now. The air smells of ash and something worse, the sweet rot of bodies in the courtyards, already left unburied for 3 days. She has not been allowed to change her clothes or wash. The fine silk robe she wore during the siege has hardened with dust and something darker. A soldier walks past her so close she can feel the heat radiating from his armor. She does not look at him. She has learned, in these 3 days of captivity, that invisibility is survival. But invisibility is also a kind of death. The northern general who now controls this region has issued his first proclamation. It speaks of integration, of the blessing of conquest, of the necessary reorganization of the provinces. What these words mean for the women standing in this courtyard is something no proclamation addresses directly. Lin's instructress, an older woman named T, who once trained concubines for the royal court, whispers in Khmer, a language they believe the soldiers do not understand. "We go now to new masters. Some of us will be fortunate, many of us will not." T's voice carries no emotion. This is the second time she has been conquered. The first time was during the Tran invasions 20 years before. She is one of the few who know what fortunate means in such circumstances. A scribe reads names from a tablet, calling women forward in groups of 10. Lin hears her name called, though they have begun to simplify the names, dropping the syllables that sound too Cham, too Southern, too foreign. She becomes Lin without the family designation, and already this feels like the first of many disappearances she will undergo. As she walks toward the holding pen with the others, she catches a final glimpse of the palace walls. The royal family is already gone, executed or fled. No one is coming to save them. No one ever does. What happened to women like Lin in ancient Vietnam is not mythology or speculation. It is documented in military chronicles, in temple records, in the administrative codes of successive dynasties, and in the rare personal letters and poems that survived centuries of warfare. The Vietnamese historical archives, preserved in both Vietnamese and Chinese sources, since much of early Vietnamese history was recorded by occupying powers, contain detailed accounts of conquest protocols, slave distribution records, and laws regulating the status of war captives. Archaeological excavations in the Red River Delta have uncovered labor camps and servant quarters attached to noble residences, with evidence of how women captives were housed, marked, and organized. The sources are unflinching. In the imperial family's administrative documents from the 14th and 15th centuries, we find not vague references but explicit accounting. Lists of women assigned to temples, to generals' households, to border garrisons. Temple dedications from this period celebrate the tribute of captive women brought as offerings. The scholar No Si Lien, in his comprehensive history of Vietnam written in the 17th century, describes these practices with the matter-of-fact tone of someone documenting bureaucratic procedure. Letters between military commanders discuss the distribution of conquered populations as though assigning livestock. What we must understand is this. These words are not accusations written by enemies. They are the conqueror's own words, their own records, preserved because they saw nothing shameful in what they did. The silence of the victims themselves is deafening. Few women from this period left written testimony, but that absence itself tells us something. It tells us that their voices were systematically eliminated, their literacy prevented, their stories confined to whispered conversations that left no trace. Only once, in a minor monastery archive, was a single poem discovered, written in careful characters on a slip of wood. I remember the color of my mother's robe. Now I wear the color of her murderer, and pretend not to remember, because remembering breaks the hand that writes. The poem is unsigned. It was discovered tucked behind a temple wall, hidden for 600 years. To understand why this happened systematically, we must first understand what defeat meant in ancient Vietnam. Vietnam was not one unified kingdom during this period. Instead, it was a collision of competing powers. The Great Tran dynasty in the north, the rising Lu power, the Cham kingdom in the Central Highlands, the Khmer to the southwest, and dozens of regional lords controlling smaller territories. When kingdoms clashed, the victor did not simply take land. The victor took control of every resource in that land, and women were perhaps the most strategically important resource of all. Women of the conquered court and nobility served multiple purposes in the victor's strategy. First, they were psychological weapons. A conquered kingdom's warriors had fought for their king, their honor, their families. When those families, especially the women and children, were taken and enslaved, the message was unmistakable. Resistance was futile. Families had no future. This wasn't cruelty alone. It was calculated terror designed to prevent future rebellions. The women became visible proof that defeat meant total annihilation of one's world. Second, women were tools of cultural assimilation. By forcing captured women into the victor's households, the conqueror literally erased the distinct identity of the defeated kingdom. Children born to these women might carry the blood of two kingdoms, but they grew up speaking the victor's language, worshiping the victor's gods, and identifying with the victor's power. Within one generation, genetic memory had been rewritten. Within two, the conquered kingdom became merely a historical fact. Third, women were economic assets. A noble's concubine or wife required food, housing, and maintenance. But she also produced value. She bore children, soldiers, administrators, future wives for advantageous marriages. She provided labor, weaving, embroidery, the manufacture of luxury goods. She could be rented out, traded, given as gifts to reward loyal officers. Temple records show that women were literally listed in the same accounting columns as rice, metal, and cloth. A young woman of nobility could have a specific trade value written beside her name in the conquest ledgers. Fourth, and this is where the religious justification becomes clear, women were offerings to the gods. The Vietnamese kingdoms of this period maintained a complex mixture of Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, and older animistic beliefs. Temple records speak of sacred offerings, of maidens devoted to the service of heaven, of rituals that required the participation of women of pure lineage and conquered status. The distinction was deliberate. A woman freely given in marriage or worship was not the same as a woman taken. The violence of conquest was transformed, through religious language, into sacred obligation. The woman herself became a hybrid thing, simultaneously a slave and a vessel, a prisoner and a priestess. The formal legal codes that governed this machinery were meticulous. Vietnamese law, heavily influenced by Confucian principles imported from China, created strict categories of female status. There were wives, women of equal or near equal status in official marriage. There were concubines, women of lower status living in a man's household without legal marriage. There were servants and slaves, women with no status except as property. But conquest created a problem for these categories. How do you classify a woman who is the daughter of a king but now a captive? How do you rationalize enslaving a woman of higher birth? The solution was elegant and brutal. The woman's old status was simply deleted. The records were rewritten. Her lineage was stripped away. She became whatever status her captor decided, and no legal argument could restore her previous identity. She was not just enslaved, she was unmade. She wakes before dawn, never allowed to sleep past the 5th hour, in a long stone room with no windows, only high openings for air. 20 women on raised platforms with mats of woven straw, the smell of sweat and sickness hanging permanent. One has never stopped coughing. No one speaks about her anymore. At the stone trough outside, Lin washes with water so cold it shocks. She watches her reflection distort and for a moment doesn't recognize herself. Her hair, once long and carefully arranged, was cut short 3 weeks ago. Easier to maintain, the guard said, though she understood the real purpose. Another way of making her previous life impossible to recognize. The short hair of a servant is also the short hair of mourning, except she is not allowed to mourn. To mourn would be to acknowledge what was taken. By the time the sun rises, she and the other women are already at work. The specific labor depends on the hierarchy even among the captives. Lin, because of her family background and apparent education, has been assigned to textile work. She sits at a loom in a large workshop with a dozen other women, and her task is to weave specific patterns into silk. The looms are in rows, facing the same direction, so it is difficult to speak to others. Conversation is not forbidden, but it is not encouraged. A supervisor walks between the rows. She is also a captive, but older, and her small position of power has made her vigilant. She will report anything that looks like conspiracy. The patterns Lin weaves are intricate, and they must be perfect. Each mistake is noted. 3 mistakes in a day means a reduction of food rations. Lin has never made mistakes. Her hands move the way they were trained to move when she was a noble girl being groomed to become a good wife. Now those same trained hands make her a valuable asset. She weaves patterns of dragons and clouds, the symbols of imperial power. She weaves them for the man who conquered her kingdom. The irony is not lost on her, but irony is a luxury only the free can afford. At midday there is food. Rice with small amounts of preserved vegetables. Tea. Occasionally a piece of salted fish. It is not unpleasant, but it is precisely measured. The goal is to keep the captives alive and strong enough to work, nothing more. Lin remembers her mother's kitchen, where she once stole candied fruits and was scolded gently. She remembers the taste of her mother's cooking. She will never taste it again. She does not allow herself to think about this during the day. The afternoon is more labor. The work is repetitive, designed not to strain the mind, but to occupy it completely. This is deliberate. An occupied mind cannot form plans. An occupied mind cannot nurture hope. Sometimes a woman begins to hum. Old songs from before, songs of home and family. The supervisors allow this for a while, then stop it. These songs are dangerous. They remind the women who they were, and who they were is precisely what must be forgotten. As evening comes, there are more inspections. A guard or official walks through the dormitories, examining the women. They check hands to see if the weaving has caused injury, but also to see if anyone has been hiding food or making marks on their skin as a form of hidden communication. They check teeth. They check for signs of pregnancy. No one is told explicitly what happens to a pregnant captive woman, but everyone knows someone who disappeared after showing signs. The silence around this knowledge is complete. There is another woman, a few platforms away from Lin's, named May. May was a musician in the royal court. She played the 13-string zither. Now her fingers are reserved for weaving only. One night, Lin hears a sound so quiet that perhaps only another captive would notice it. May, making the movement of playing an invisible instrument against her legs, her fingers moving in the exact patterns they once moved across the strings. No sound emerges, but the pattern is there. It is a small act of resistance, and it is so quiet that no guard can punish it. Yet it is also an act of devastation, because it keeps alive the memory of who she was, and that memory will make everything she endures hurt more. Lin reaches out one night, in the darkness when the supervisor is sleeping, and takes May's hand. They do not speak. They do not need to. This moment of human contact, this brief acknowledgement that they are still themselves beneath the erasure, is the most dangerous act either of them has performed. If discovered, it could result in separation, in punishment. But it is also the only moment in weeks where Lin feels present in her own body, rather than observing it from a distance. These moments of connection are what this apparatus is designed to prevent. Because if the captive women remember that they are human, that they love each other, that they have a dignity that cannot be taken, then control becomes more difficult. The machinery works best when the captives believe, on some deep level, that they deserve what is happening to them, that they are inferior, that their purpose is to serve. The daily routine, the exhaustion, the measured food, the forced labor, all of it is designed to teach this lesson until it becomes something the women believe about themselves. But the daily misery of labor was not the central horror of this machinery. The central horror was what happened during the designated ritual occasions, and what happened in the households of powerful men who chose certain captives for their own purposes. For women assigned to temples, the sacred service began on specific festival dates. The official language always described these as rituals of blessing, or sacred unions. What the women experienced was different. They were prepared, bathed, dressed in fine clothing they would never be allowed to wear otherwise, and then brought before the king, a high general, a priest, or a wealthy landowner. The act that followed was called by the euphemism receiving heaven's will, or becoming a vessel of the gods. It had no consent. It had no negotiation. It had only power, masked in religious language. The temple records describe these events as offerings. The women themselves described them, in the rare moments they could speak safely, as violation. A woman named Chen, whose testimony was recorded decades later in the margin of a temple text by a sympathetic monk, wrote, "They said I was blessed to serve the god. What I felt was unspeakable, something that broke inside me and had no name." The monk who recorded this felt compelled to add a note. These women bear the unbearable and show no sign of it in their daily work. Their silence is not consent. Their obedience is not acceptance. These are the performances the machinery demands of them. In the households of nobles, a different kind of ritualized violation occurred. Some women were selected to become concubines, a status officially recognized with specific legal rights. But those rights were minimal and existed only to protect the master's interests. A concubine could not refuse her lord. She had no grounds for complaint. Any pregnancy she conceived would be credited to her master, though she had no certainty of the child's paternity and no guarantee that her child would be treated as legitimate. She lived always at the mercy of her lord's temperament, his shifting interests, and the jealousy of legitimate wives. But worse than the concubines were the women with no official status. They were sometimes called service women, or simply women for use. These were captives who had been placed in a lord's household with no protection of any law, no acknowledgement of any human status. What happened to them happened entirely in private, entirely without witness, entirely with impunity. Their abuse was not ceremonial or disguised as honor. It was simply abuse, and it was systematic. The archives suggest that these women often disappeared after a few years. Where they went, what happened to them, the records do not say. Lin was not assigned to a temple. Her punishment was perhaps worse in its randomness. She was placed in the household of a mid-ranking military administrator who had been rewarded with a portion of the conquered land and its resources. In this household, she was neither wife, nor concubine, nor servant. She had no formal status. She wove during the day. She was available during the night. She was fed. She was not technically owned in the legal sense, because technically she had no right to be owned at all. In the law, she barely existed. There is one night she might have resisted. There is one night when the man came to her, drunk and careless, and for a moment there was an opportunity to act. She could have reached for the lamp oil, heated and near. She could have done something to damage him, to hurt him, to make him regret coming to her. In that moment, she understood that this regime's greatest victory was not that it prevented resistance. It was that it taught women like her that resistance was impossible, that any action would result in worse punishment, that her only power lay in endurance. She did not reach for the lamp oil. She did not resist. Instead, she performed what was required, and after it was over, she lay motionless until morning. She told no one. She would never tell anyone. Because to speak about it would be to acknowledge it, and to acknowledge it would be to understand what had been done to her, and understanding would crack the careful walls she had built inside her own mind to survive. The structure of conquering and enslaving women from defeated kingdoms was not secret. It was not hidden away. It was public policy, and as time went on, officials began to debate its legitimacy. These debates are recorded in court documents from the 15th and 16th centuries, and they are fascinating in their moral logic. Some officials argued, in the language of Confucianism, that the apparatus was justified because it brought order to chaos. A defeated kingdom's women, they argued, had lost the protection of their former rulers and thus had lost all social standing. What was the alternative to their captivity? Starvation? Abandonment? The regime, in this view, was actually merciful. It provided the women with food, housing, and a clear role in society. The men making these arguments were not monsters defending monsters. They were genuinely convinced that they were being compassionate, but other officials saw opportunity differently. Women of royal blood, they argued, had market value. They could cement alliances through strategic marriages or reward capable generals with wives of prestigious lineage. These captives were assets to be managed, not charity cases to be pitied. A broken concubine was worth less than an intact one. Protecting them meant maximizing their usefulness. The most heated debates centered on temples and religious practice. Some Buddhist monks argued that forcing women into sacred service violated Buddhist principles regarding consent and suffering. But the counterargument was powerful. The women were already captives, already removed from normal society. To place them in temples was to give them a role, a purpose, a kind of dignity. Some of the women, the religious authorities argued, might even find salvation through this service. The suffering itself, if borne properly, could become a path to enlightenment. Those who resisted were resisting their own possible salvation. A few voices raised more radical objections. In a memorial submitted to the king in 1432, an official named Nguyen Trai argued that the scale of captive taking had become economically counterproductive and morally corrosive. He claimed that the constant warfare and enslavement of women was causing population collapse in conquered territories, making them less valuable as economic assets. He suggested modest reforms, official categories for captive women that would grant them minimal legal protections, limits on temple sacred service, rules preventing the most egregious abuses. His proposals were discussed, debated, and then largely ignored. A few reforms did pass. By the middle of the 15th century, there were official codes regarding the treatment of captive women. They specified how often they could be beaten, what kinds of labor they could be forced to perform, and, in rare cases, how they might petition for legal status. But these reforms did not free anyone. They did not end the apparatus. They simply made it more orderly, more bureaucratic, and potentially more stable. A regime that killed its captives quickly might invite rebellion. A regime that kept its captives alive, regulated, and hopeful for small improvements might keep them docile. The reality is that most captive women remained trapped. Even if reform laws passed, their enforcement was inconsistent. A woman had no way to prove abuse, no way to access the courts, no authority that would listen to her. The laws existed primarily to protect the apparatus from criticism, not to protect the women from harm. By the time meaningful reforms began, and it took centuries, millions of women had already lived and died as captives. The structure had become so normalized that no one even called it what it was. It was simply how society functioned. We tell these stories because history is not a relic. The monuments of ancient Vietnam still stand. You can walk through temple ruins and see the architecture where these rituals took place. You can see the names of military commanders carved in stone, men who are remembered as great generals and wise administrators. No one has carved the names of the women who were brought as prisoners to their households. No one has built monuments to their resilience, their suffering, their impossible choices. What we are looking at when we examine this period of ancient Vietnamese history is not exotic cruelty practiced by a foreign culture. We are looking at a pattern that appears again and again across every region of the world, every period of history. When one group gains power over another, women become spoils. When a society wants to erase a people, it does so partly by taking control of their women. When a regime needs to perpetuate itself, it does so partly through the reproduction and re-education of the next generation. The structure we see in 15th century Vietnam is the same structure that appears in conquered territories across human history. A sophisticated apparatus that combines ritual and bureaucracy, religious justification and legal codes, all designed to make the unthinkable become routine. The genius of such structures is that they make the victims partially complicit in their own oppression. The women who were captives learned to believe on some deep level that this was how things had to be, that their suffering was natural, that resistance was futile, that their only dignity lay in performing well the role they had been given. This wasn't chaos, it was policy. This wasn't random cruelty, it was systematic. And it was maintained not through violence alone, but through a vast apparatus of ritual, law, religion, and bureaucracy that made the violence seem necessary, even just. The ruins of these cities still exist. Tourists walk through the ancient temples where these rituals occurred. They read plaques that describe the architecture, the artistic achievements, the historical significance. They do not read about the women who were held captive in chambers behind the sanctuaries. They do not see monuments to Lin, or May, or Chen, or the thousands of other women whose names were stripped away and whose stories were forgotten. But the fact that they were forgotten does not mean they did not happen. The absence of their voices does not mean they were not there. And the normalization of their suffering does not mean it was normal, or just, or acceptable. When we study history, we learn what civilizations build and how they organize themselves. But we also learn what they destroy, and who they destroy it, and how. The deeper truth is this: civilization is measured not by its monuments, but by how it treats those with no power. It is measured by the choices of women in captivity, whether they manage, in the smallest ways, to hold on to themselves. It is measured by how a society remembers them, or whether it remembers them at all. Lady Linh lived through the occupation and survived into old age. She never returned to her family's home. She never married freely. She raised a daughter by one of the men who held her, and she taught that daughter to survive the way she had survived, by being small, by being useful, by being silent. Her granddaughter married a Vietnamese officer and assimilated fully into the victor's culture. By the third generation, the distinction between victor and vanquished had blurred beyond recognition. The conquest was complete. Yet somewhere in that lineage, in the genetic memory, and perhaps in ways even they could not articulate, some echo of before remained. The capacity to endure unbearable things, the knowledge of what was taken, a particular kind of silence that was not empty, but full of unexpressed sorrow. These are the stories we need to tell about the past. Not the stories of great battles and famous generals, but the stories of the women who were the cost of those victories. The stories of what it took to be human in a structure designed to obliterate your humanity. The stories that force us to sit with discomfort, because comfort is the enemy of understanding. If you believe these stories shouldn't be forgotten, if you believe that the smallest voices deserve to be heard across centuries of silence, subscribe. Uncomfortable truths about our past shape what we do in the future. The choice to remember is the choice to be different than those who conquered, enslaved, and obliterated.